actually is an alternative, right? That it is possible for us to have sort of workable economies of scale, right? But without, without the exploitation of labor and and capitalistic private property and these sorts of things. So I think that, any kind of effort that's geared towards empowering, workers with a mind to, transforming and democratizing their workplaces is a even if it is incremental, it's even if it is death by 1,000 paper cuts kind of thing. Like that's a sort of a, to my mind, it's a feasible sort of strategy to, if not completely dismantle capitalism, to at least substantially weaken it over time.
Totally agree with that. The IWW has a campaign that recently closed in New York. A restaurant owned by some big shot, and place right at the, what do you call that place, that little wedge? No, I think it's Union Grand Central? No, Dam Square.
Yes.
There you go. Restaurant workers start complaining that they don't have breaks, they don't have enough braces, whatever. Their complaints go unheard for a couple of years. A lot of them get fired just simply for complaining. Until they decide that they're going to organize. And they're not going to organize with a regular labor union. They're going to organize with a union that will push for more long-term organizing. So they reach out to the IWW. The IWW wants to abolish the wage system and has an anti-capitalist stance. And again, to be repetitive, organizes the worker and not the restaurant alone. These workers do all kinds of creative, crazy direct action things. They are in a very specific location where all eyes are on them, and their campaigns gain a lot of traction, a lot of support. Forward a year and a half, I think 2, they just won their campaign. And it happened through, I'm sure there were lots of tears and sweat that went into the organizing. The end result was that a lot of the formerly fired employees were given their positions back, and back pay included. And that was a gain that might not seem like it's bringing down, the structure of how labor is organized in the U.S. in particular. But goddamn, those workers were very, very impressed at how much power they had. And I think if every location had a similar projection of what they could do, I'm not saying it would happen overnight, or in 10 years or 20 years, but the world used to be, slaves. It used to be, we were under a monarchy in some parts of the world, and now we are not. So who knows how long it's going to take, but it's happening. Another quick example, a really good comrade of ours in Northern California lives in Mountain View, right next to Cupertino, where your Apple computers are made. Lots of money, also very expensive housing, because they are right next to Cupertino and they're in the San Francisco Bay Area. The rent goes up, people complain. So they decide to hey, why don't we get together and talk about bringing rent control to our city? Unheard of. Rent control passed in 1976 in Los Angeles, so we're talking many decades of nothing like what happened in LA, happening in other cities in California. Well, they really worked really hard, and our comrade is an anarchist. He was one of the main organizers, but by far the whole the committee that was running the show was not anarchists. It was simply renters. And they ran a campaign with the city, they canvassed day in, day out, and they passed it. Pomona, Claremont, I don't think has rent control. If you could picture having to stabilize how much you pay for rent, which people in Northern California are probably giving their whole entire paycheck to rent, it's a big game. You're talking people who no longer have to choose between having a meal or having to pay for rent. Again, in the macro view, nothing happened. But in the individual's life, the quality increased just a bit. And I think it's that. It's like, what are the gains that you can achieve on your day-to-day needs?
I think we'll take one more question.
Okay. So y'all have spoken generally pretty positively about just like the examples you just gave, or examples like you supporting Bernie Sanders and things like that, of relatively small scale actions that might not bring about massive structural change but are good in and of themselves. And you've also spoken critically about sort of the authoritarian left, the gulag, things like that. So my question is, do you think, I guess probably the best example of this is sort of like Mao's China, when Mao was actually running things, which obviously made some strides in the right direction in terms of abolishing capitalism, educating the populace, creating equality for peasants, things like that. Obviously also had some issues, Cultural Revolution, probably not the best thing ever, but made some moves towards, potentially, a sort of withering way of the state or whatever. Do you all think that those sorts of authoritarian socialist movements can have a similar sort of, I guess, heuristic value for making larger structural change, or do you think that the sort of negatives of them kind of outweigh any of those benefits?
You want to take it?
I don't know. I don't quite know how to answer that.
You were in Cuba, right?
I think any social revolution teaches you things that are possible, but also lessons learned. For example, I'm sorry, I'm not very well versed in China, just American politics much. I actually come from Latin American studies and things like that. In Cuba, there's a lot of contradictions. The outward projection is that it's a socialist country, that everyone has healthcare, that everyone has a meal. It's really cool and very positive and very hopeful to hear it when you're not inside Cuba. We were lucky enough to meet with anarchist comrades, and the reality is slightly different. There's definitely a good chunk of Cubans inside Cuba who look up to the U.S. and they want a little sliver of capitalist U.S. life. And then there are the ones who are like diehard Fidel followers forever and ever. And then there's everyone in between. The population in Cuba is very split between knowing that this is a good long-term gain that happened after the revolution, to know that you can surely go to the market and get groceries at no charge. But if you have a little bit of money, you can also get a chicken. And if you have a little more money, because it's still based on money, you can go to a better hospital and get a heart transplant if you need one. If you don't, good luck. So there are a lot of contradictions that we noticed in Cuba. And unfortunately, I feel like we can only hear so much directly from the comrades. What we did hear was that there's still a lot to be gained inside quote-unquote socialist Cuba. The comrades are trying. So the gains have been limited. They see this as a continuous struggle for them as socialists, as anarchists, as anarcho-communists, who are trying to figure things out. So yes, there were gains, and I think as time progresses, just more people are going to be discontent inside Cuba. But hopefully also the comrades who are organizing there could also, open up ways to show that their criticisms are valid and that therefore they need to reorganize inside somehow. We met an organization of like a more working, all of Cuba's working class, but there are more poorer towns. We went to a particular one where their demand as a neighborhood is to make sure that the one open spot, a cafe in a corner where you don't need to consume, can stay open for it to be a social space where people can meet and continue having a chit-chat or whatever, because gentrification is also entering Cuba. If you can believe that, foreigners are buying up land over there. So yeah, there were gains after the revolution, but gains don't reach everyone, haven't reached everyone, even in a socialist revolutionary context.
This is a really good question. It's a tough one. I mean, anarchists were involved in the Russian Revolution, the centennial which we were recognizing this month, right? We're involved in the Chinese Revolution and so forth, right? And there's a sort of tendency to sort of, it's sort of American sort of consciousness to sort of treat the historical personages involved as though they were just sort of monsters, the Lenins and the Maos and the Stalins and so. But if you just sort of put to one side the question of these cults of personality and individual psychology and so forth, and you just sort of focus on their stated, and whether these rationalizations were made in good faith or not, their stated rationalizations for some of these authoritarian policies, they actually call attention to some very, very important questions, right? I mean, the traditional, to this day, I mean, the justification for the transitional dictatorship of the proletariat, right, is to forestall capitalist counter-revolution, right? The Bolsheviks had to deal with the Allied Expeditionary Force in addition to the white, to the white army, right? They had to deal with it. They predicted that there was going to be a reaction, and there was a reaction, and they were arguably able to fend off that reaction, right, by instilling the sort of authoritarian dictatorship of the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, right? But this raises a question, and this was the central sort of disagreement between Stalin and his camp and Trotsky and his camp. Can you have socialism in one country, right? Why did the anarchist experiments in Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War fail? Could it possibly be because fighting a war is not the ideal time to create a social revolution? You can fight the fascists or you can create the social revolution, but can you do both at once? Right? Probably not. Okay. Was Nestor Makhno's experiments in the Ukraine in the 1920s, where they failed because anarchism is intellectually or morally bankrupt, or was it because he was fighting the Red Army? Right. There are serious practical questions that these historical sort of socialist experiments call attention to. One of which is, what do you do if you actually win? What do you do if the revolution actually succeeds, right? What do you have to do to ensure that you maintain that success, right? Because presumably the other people surrounding you are not going to be too keen on what you've just accomplished, and they're going to try to stop it, right? So what do you need to do in order to, to ensure that the initial successes of the revolution become permanent? Well, the Bolsheviks' answer to that was we need to instill a sort of authoritarianism. And by the way, I mean, that seems to be, just sort of looking at that in isolation, that seems to be a totally reasonable response, right? If we're fighting a war and our objective is just to secure the ends of the revolution, right? I mean, do we really want to be messing around with civil liberties and so on and so forth? Or do we want to defer to on the side of security? Well, the problem, of course, is that they never relinquished this authoritarian apparatus. In fact, they kept escalating it. But even when they escalated it, we can still sort of understand on some level why they escalated it, right? And that's the whole story of the Cold War, right there, right? I mean, if you're the sole sort of major, ostensibly socialistic regime in the world, right, and you come to believe that you are surrounded on all sides by enemies, right, who are hell bent on ensuring that you fail, right? What is to prevent you from being a permanent sort of, tyrannical, totalitarian dictatorship, right? You could keep on sort of recycling that justification, and by the way, as far as it goes, it's a totally legitimate justification. So the question for anarchists then is, well, let's suppose that, what if, revolutionary Barcelona in 1936, had succeeded? What if the historical situation had been different? How would that revolution have been sustained over time in a way that is consistent with anarchist principles? Would it have eventually, would it have given into the temptation, so to speak, right, to adopt authoritarianism for the sake of maintaining the revolution, right? And if it did, right, what does that say about the practicability of anarchism, right? So yeah, this is just by way of saying that my comrade is right. There are all kinds of lessons that can be. It's not even just lessons. It's that there's questions that, that the existence, that sort of history of these regimes sort of call attention to, that we have to wrestle with in earnest. I don't know that half of them have ready to hand or easy answers, right? I'm just not sure, right? For example, how if you understand sort of revolution in sort of spontaneous sort of terms, how can you possibly make a revolution without authoritarianism? It's a really tough it's a tough question, right? But then of course it invites us to sort of rethink maybe what we mean by revolution and so forth. So it's a very, very good question.
Cool, so I think that we're going to end it there, but we have the space for a little bit longer, so if you want to maybe just go up and talk, or ask any other questions you may have not been able to or follow-up questions or anything.
I want to throw in one more thing, just in general, since everyone's still here. I have a very fond relationship with a lot of Claremont students who in my generation were very active and very supportive of campaigns that we had going on as students in other parts of Los Angeles. When telling them that I was coming here, one thing that was mentioned was, you should remind students at Claremont that there's been radical struggles led by students in the campuses and in the community, and that you should dig up that history to learn from their mistakes, but also to propel whatever campaigns you have going on. There was, at some point, a funny anecdote of students ran on a radical slate for student government, and with the consortium, I don't understand which campus it was or where it happened exactly, but they were very unhappy with the hierarchical way of deciding how student things are run, from financial to programmatic to whatever, and they decided that they were going to run, and they won. Your campuses chose a radical slate of students that wanted to change student life, the quality of your education in general. And they won, and one of the first things that they decided to do was to abolish the current student government structure and make it a horizontal form. Sadly, the administration, I'm not sure if just one or all of the campuses, decided that they were all crazy and that they were all be put on probation or expelled if they didn't change things back to how they were. And so there was a mumbo jumbo and things went back to normal. But just to think that your whole student community was unhappy with how things were and that they almost changed it, spoke millions of hopeful things about what you as a student can do. Maybe not in student government, but in other parts of your quality of life as students. Yeah, just wanted to share that so you remember those games.
Thank you so much.
And we have 3 pamphlets here.
Yeah.